Okay, so for my paper in Atlantic World, I did it over the slave life in Suriname. My paper's title is called Slave Life in Suriname, the Blood Spilling Colony. My thesis is that the treatment of the slaves caused the slaves to flee and revolt against the colony plantation owners, and had their treatment have been better, they would not have formed the maroon communities and would have been less likely to have caused the doom of the colony of Suriname. I used first-hand accounts from Stedman, Suriname, to prove that torture and cruelty that was inflicted upon the slaves was the reason that the Dutch colony of Suriname was doomed. Stedman came out of retirement a little over and was in Suriname a little over 4 years. He was part of a corps of 800 European volunteers that fought against the escaped slaves. Upon arrival in Suriname, the slaves were not really fit to even work when they got there. Most were ill from their trip over, and if they had survived, they were still very dehydrated and not in very good shape. They were walked around like they were prizes, and they were given baths and new clothes before they were sold. They were weighed after they got to Suriname and to see how much weight they had lost during the voyage. They used a lot of different torture devices in this colony, and that's what I will focus on, is the different types of ways that they did torture the slaves. Stedman, when he first arrived in the colony, he wrote of an encounter with a treatment with the slave upon stepping on the land, just right when he first got there. He said he met a miserable woman in the chain, simply covered with a rag around her loins, which was like her skin, and carved by the lash of a whip in a most shocking manner. Her crime was that she didn't fulfill her task, which apparently she was just unable to do. Her punishment was 200 lashes, 4 months to drag a chain several yards in length, for which one end was locked to the ankle and the other end was locked to a weight of some 70 pounds. The cruelty that was used was very gruesome. The most shocking execution was of 11 poor captives. They experimented to terrify, if possible, their companions, and thus to make them return to their duty. To see men flogged was like a daily occurrence there. Flogging is something that happened to pretty much everyone there, all the slaves at least. The lifestyle of the slaves was horrible. The woman that Stedman first encountered, when she got there, was simply just covered with a rag around the loins. She didn't have any type of clothes or anything. Even the men didn't have any clothes. They were naked as they were born. A small strip of cheek or other linen cloth was just wrapped around them, and that was about all they had. They made the slaves do things like staying up all night and fanning their masters, just to keep the masters cool. And they had to serve their food nearly nude to the plantation owners, which probably was a little bit strange. The slaves in Suriname did speak out a lot about their treatment that they had. The slave whom was interviewed a decade after this was over said that when they work in the sugar mills and the grindstone, that if you cut your finger, they'll just cut your hand off. And when they tried to run away, they just cut your leg off. They didn't think anything of just whacking off hands and legs or whatever was just in the way. And what would keep them from doing what they didn't want them to do, which was flee. He said, the slave said that that was a price that they paid for the people in Europe just to have sugar, which I find it kind of strange because I don't know that I could eat sugar thinking about someone lost their finger in the same grinder that the sugar was made in. That's kind of strange. The punishments, again, were like flogging, which was beating with a whipper rod, happened all day. Any person could be whipped. Stedman was quoted in saying that all Negroes cry out when they're being flogged, which I can imagine is very painful. They were to be shot, just for anything, just shot. To resist being escaped was definitely impossible. They would tie you up, and it was very hard to resist. They would hang people alive by their ribs. They make an indention in their ribs and hang a hook through their ribs and hang them from a pole and just leave them. Kind of like using them as an example to make sure that everyone knew that this person did something wrong and this would happen to you if you did anything wrong. Their way of scaring people into working. One man lived for 3 days just hanging there. They could be killed for any reasons. Anything they wanted to be. They had their faces burned just by a plantation owner's wife because she thought the slave was too pretty. So she was jealous, so they burned her face to make her not as pretty anymore. If you did not have sex with the master, the wife or daughters of slaves, they could be killed. If you're a male and you try to keep your wife or daughter from having sex with the master, you could be easily killed, just shot. There was other tortures for smaller crimes. Plunging, which is just being poked by a red-hot poker in the body in parts which are not very pleasant to be poked in, I'm sure. Another way they tried to punish their slaves was tying their ankles with chains so close that they could barely move. I can't imagine if you tie their legs very close together and they can't move, how they're able to work and how you would expect someone to work when they couldn't even move. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me to treat them so horribly if you expected them to work. A common practice was also like quartered life, which they would lay them down on a board and spread their feet and the arms in 4 different directions and tie the arms to a rope and have horses pull each direction, which pretty much would just pull you apart. That had to be probably one of the more severe things besides the hanging from the ribs. Some of the pictures in Stedman's book, like the woman hanging from a tree with deep cuts in her back, I can only imagine how much painful this was to even just see your family members being beaten like this. The slaveholders tried to strike fear into the slaves in hopes that the others would be too scared to disobey and they would work harder, longer, and better. For the most part, though, the strategy really just failed. They escaped. They ran to the interior of the country where the maroon communities are, and they would, at night, go into the former plantation owners' homes and pillage through everything and destroy stuff. They committed continual outrages and deprivations upon the sugar and coffee plantations, which ultimately led to the colony losing money. Stedman gives an account of how they treated injured slaves that helped even with, like in the Black Rangers, if they would lead the way. If they happened to get hurt or anything, they would just put a gun in their mouth and just shoot them. And they wouldn't even try to heal them or wrap their wound up in any way. they would just dispose of them. They had to go first, these Black Rangers did, in front of all of the colony's soldiers, so that any of the Maroon community's traps or poison water or anything that they have done to help in their protecting of their communities would get the Black Rangers first before it would get the colony soldiers. Although it was a good fact that the blacks did get to be involved in the Black Rangers, they would at least get their freedom after their service if they lived through their service, which is one thing that was good. The Maroon communities within the colony, they would use guerrilla warfare and any other tactics that they could to ward off the soldiers. So the likelihood of one of the Black Rangers living is slim to none. The escape from this cruel existence fueled a lot of the slaves to escape. They would go and put traps in the plantation owners' homes that eventually would kill the plantation owners for what they had done to their family members. Historians like John Stedman notes the use of details, which signals the sign of truth. Rebellions were armed by slaves. Slave rebellions happened in nearly all of the civilizations that practiced slavery. Obviously, slavery was not something that was able to really live long due to the treatment that was put upon the slaves. Thomas Lacour is one of the main historians that uses Stedman's book a lot too. He says how the descriptions, the very detailed descriptions, prove that it has to be a sign of truth as to how things are done. Eugene Genovis was also a leading historian that said that the probability of a slave revolt is very high if, one, the master-slave relationship had developed in the context of depersonalization as well as greater cultural estrangement of whites on black, or two, economic distress and famine occurred if the plantation owner was unable to feed or properly clothe the slaves. 3, slaveholding units approached the average size of 100 to 200 slaves. Is the bigger you got, the less chance that they would stay, because the larger the number of slaves, the less people you have to look over them, and the more probability that they will revolt, because you can get bigger groups of them banding together. If blacks heavily outnumbered them, which is pretty much kind of what I just said, they would be able to easily overtake the masters or the people who were supposed to be in charge of them, and then just revolt. If the terrain provided an opportunity for colonies of runaway slaves, that also fueled the slave to revolt. Which in Suriname, having the interior the way it was, the Maroon communities were able to hide their communities with moats around them, and it was easier to get away from the colony's soldiers if you had such homes to go to already. The Negroes were well aware of the fact that the working was not benefiting anyone but the master, and this also helped in fueling them to revolt and flee. Olmsted's Seaboard Slave States notes that the extended loafing and mingling of slaves also would lead to slaves running away. In conclusion, the scholars and people whom survived most part of all of the treatment of the slaves agree that the direct cause to the fleeing of slaves was the uprising or revolts within Suriname due to treatment of the slaves by the plantation owners. And most all agree that if had slave life been a little more pleasant, then and treatment would have been just a little better, that there would have been a less likelihood to have so many slave rebellions, and slavery could have lasted many years longer, and plantations the size that they were would have been bigger and better operated with slaves if they had treated them better.